Bedtime Stories made for you by Diggy and George. The Owl in the Grasshopper. Mrs. Owl was an old owl. It was also a well-known fact that Mrs. Owl was a mean owl. Every afternoon, Mrs. Owl napped in the old oak tree. The other animals knew not to disturb Mrs. Owl while she was sleeping. If they had to pass the old oak tree, they tiptoes and whispered. None of them dared to wake up Mrs. Owl. Mr. Grasshopper, however, was new to the forest, and he didn't know about Mrs. Owl. So one day, he sat down near the old oak tree and started playing a song. When Mrs. Owl heard the song, she popped her head out of her hole in the tree. "What's all that racket?" she yelled. "I'm just playing a song," said Mr. Grasshopper. "Well, stop. It is my nap time, and no one makes noise during my nap time," she shouted. "I can play wherever and whenever I want," said Mr. Grasshopper. He played his song even louder, making Mrs. Owl very mad. Mrs. Owl realized that telling Mr. Grasshopper to stop playing only made it worse. She was too tired to argue anyway, so she came up with another plan. "I suppose your song isn't so bad," said Mrs. Owl. "Since you have woken me, I'm going to enjoy listening to it." Mrs. Owl invited Mr. Grasshopper up for tea. "Maybe after having a drink of tea, you will be able to play even more beautifully," said Mrs. Owl. Mr. Grasshopper accepted Mrs. Owl's invitation. He jumped into her den, ready for a cup of tea. What Mr. Grasshopper didn't know was that the owl loves to eat grasshopper. Mrs. Owl intended to have him for lunch. "Come closer, Mr. Grasshopper," said Mrs. Owl. "My eyesight is getting worse in my old age, and I like to see you as you play." Mr. Grasshopper moved closer to Mrs. Owl and started to play. "Wow, your music is so beautiful," said Mrs. Owl. Mrs. Owl invited Mr. Grasshopper to come even closer. Flattered by Mrs. Owl's praise, Mr. Grasshopper kept moving closer. After he finished his song, Mrs. Owl handed Mr. Grasshopper a cup of tea. "Drink up. It will make you play even more beautifully," she said. As Mr. Grasshopper reached for the cup of tea, Mrs. Owl jumped on Mr. Grasshopper. Then she ate him up in one giant bite. "That will teach him a lesson. Never disturb an old owl when she sleeps," said Mrs. Owl. Indeed, that day, Mrs. Owl did teach Mr. Grasshopper a lesson. Always be cautious of praise that comes from an enemy.